So hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. This is a topic I'm incredibly passionate about, and I am very grateful to the Center for Healthy Sex for asking me to come and speak on this. So we're going to talk about intimacy and body bias. We're going to talk a lot about weight stigma. This is what we're going to cover. So weight stigma, what it is and what it impacts. Weight stigma and relationships, weight stigma and gender, internalized weight bias, and tools for overcoming internalized weight bias. That's what we're talking about today. So I want to start by discussing terminology. Language is really important. And the first term that I think is important to discuss is obesity. Obesity, so dictionary.com described it as grossly fat or overweight. And it is a description of body size based on something called the body mass index. Now, the body mass index was originally created in 1830. I think he was a mathematician and a sociologist. It was not intended to be a determinant of health. It became used by the United States as a determinant of health in 1985. There are a lot of arguments against body mass index not being a good determinant of health, not the least of which is that professional athletes like The Rock, who's also an actor, and so many others, their BMI lists them as obese. So it's also not entirely accurate. So BMI for obesity would be anything that is 30 or above. And it was declared a disease in 2013. And that also was riddled with a lot of conflict, because what obesity is a suggestion that based on someone's body size, it puts them at risk for certain diseases. But those risk factors are not a disease. It's a correlation, not a causation. And there really aren't a lot of studies that are showing that obesity is causing these things, but it's correlated with, which is an important distinction. Overweight is another distinction in BMI. It is a BMI between 25 and 30. Overweight used to be 27, so apparently the powers that be decided that to be in the normal range, they dropped it down a couple points. And the definition is above a weight considered normal or desirable. So if you're thinking in terms of how you're talking about someone's body size, when you're using words like grossly fat or talking about what's desirable, then it's not a judgment-free descriptor. It is interladen with people's opinions and stereotypes. And so what do we say instead? A couple of the primary preferred terms are fat or larger bodied. Now, not everyone is comfortable with the use of the word fat, but there is a lot of fat activism out there that is attempting to change that. A lot of times people use the phrase larger bodied instead. For most of this presentation, I'll use fat or larger bodied interchangeably, but I will a little bit use obesity because we're talking about research. So, weight stigma assumptions. The first assumption is that obesity is a disease, and we talked about that. Some people believe that it is, and some people believe that it is not. It is in causation, but when you talk about causation in terms of causing type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, what you also need to know is that when people do the yo-yo dieting, gaining weight and losing it and gaining it and losing it, that's called weight cycling. And weight cycling puts you at a higher risk for type 2 diabetes, heart conditions, blood pressure, cortisol levels being increased, and inflammation in the body. So the very things that they talk about that obesity causes are the very things that the cure, the constantly trying to lose weight and then regain it, that's the same thing that gets caused there. So another one is that thinner people are healthier. There was a study that was done within the last couple of years where they talked about people who were in that normal BMI range and compared them to people in the overweight BMI range. And they found that the people in the overweight range actually live longer. Additionally, people in the obese range and the people in the normal weight range seem to have the same lifespan. So, you know, being thinner doesn't necessarily mean that you're healthier or you're going to live longer. Weight loss improves long-term health. So there are studies that show short-term benefits from weight loss. There are no studies that show long-term. I suspect part of that is that there are no studies that show successful long-term weight loss for a large enough population to do a study on it. Weight loss is within a person's control. So what they say nowadays is what you eat and how much you move your body is a pretty small sliver of what actually determines how large or small your body is. There are a lot of other components, some of which being genetics and socioeconomic status. So it's not entirely within your control. In fact, there's reasons why it may really not be in your control that I will mention in a few minutes. So weight loss is an effective solution to obesity. UCLA did a study of like 70 different weight loss studies. And one of the things that they talked about that really stuck with me is the number one predictor of gaining weight is actually going on a diet. They found that the vast majority, like 90–95% of people who go on diets regain all their weight within 5 years, that 1/3 to 2/3 of that population regain extra. So it's like you regain what you originally lost plus interest within 2 to 5 years. So it doesn't look like an effective solution to obesity. Thinner equals happier. So again, I would argue that, you know, like in my practice as a therapist, I see a lot of people who are thin and they're not necessarily happy. It doesn't equal happiness. What is true is that you experience less stigma when you're in a thinner body, that you are able to go buy clothing in regular stores that don't sell clothing beyond a 12 or maybe a couple of 14s. And so there are a lot of things within the culture that make you feel better about yourself when you're thinner, but it doesn't equate to happiness. Fatter equals lazy, sloppy, an overeater, someone who's dumb. Those are some ideas that we have. You always see on the romantic comedies, there's the fat person who's like the best friend and the sidekick. And then the person who gets like the great romantic experience is always someone in a thinner body. And then the war on obesity is helpful and motivating. No, just no. Since the war on obesity, which probably started in the mid-'80s, if anything, it's been a complete failure because we've watched body sizes becoming larger. We've also watched the diet industry grow, which is something else I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And as terms of motivation, shaming really isn't all that motivating. There's a program that you all may have heard about called The Biggest Loser. And they did a study that showed that just watching a single episode of The Biggest Loser will impact how you feel about fat people just from watching one episode, let alone how fat people feel about themselves when they're watching it. So no, I don't think all this war on obesity has been helpful. Okay, so weight stigma defined. So I wanted to point out the image that I'm using, this graphic. If you look, you can see the thin body, and inside the thin body, they have all of these, you know, healthy foods, right? The fruits and vegetables and fish and things like that. And then they have the fat body where they've got all the fun foods, right? They've got hamburgers and donuts and hot dogs. But this definitely fits in with the stigma and this idea that people who are in larger bodies, all they eat is junk food. and people who are thin, all they eat is healthy food. And so weight stigma is discrimination or stereotyping based on a person's weight. And I love this image for showing what that looks like. Weight stigma in the media. So I don't know if any of you saw this happening last year, but Bill Maher went on a rant promoting the idea that fat shaming needs to make a comeback to really push fat people to stop eating so much. And James Corden had a comeback that I really enjoyed, suggesting that fat shaming really has never gone anywhere, and that all it does is lead to depression and anxiety and self-destructive behaviors. It actually leads to more destructive outcomes than just that, which I will talk about in a few minutes. And then he has that comeback for Bill Maher that's, while you're encouraging people to watch what goes into their mouths, just think a little bit about what's coming out of yours. I gave a little cheer when I saw that. Okay. So you can't talk about weight stigma without also talking about diet culture. Diet culture is a system that values weight, shape, and size over health and well-being. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's not true. I mean, it's all about health and well-being. But the truth is, and what I know to be true, is a lot of those diets that they put people on, those very calorie intakes and food restrictions, if it were in a person in a thinner body, you'd be treating them for anorexia. That there's tremendous malnutrition that happens with a lot of these diets, and it is congratulated and celebrated all over the media and with friends and family, and it's a problem. So weight culture provides food with a moral value. Vegetables are good, carbs are bad. And then we attach those moral values onto ourselves. So when I eat vegetables, I'm being good. And when I eat carbs, I'm being bad. And we see it and hear it all the time in common language. So the effects of diet culture, this is kind of small, so I'm going to lean in, or maybe that's my eyes. But in 2001, healthy food options were smoothies, granola, yogurt, eggs, and deli lunch meat. And just like looking at, eggs is always a good one, because in my lifetime, I've watched eggs go in and out of being called healthy and not healthy. Excellent breakfast option packed with protein and healthy fat. But today, you might hear people say that they're too high in fat and raises your cholesterol. And it's not that, someone who has a cholesterol problem, that's between them and their doctor, right? But as a blanket statement, a lot of these things, they change over time, and it's just what comes in and out of style. Diet culture is driven by a multi-billion-dollar industry that grows more every year. The last number I saw that it was a $70 billion industry. And it's predicated on seeing you not as a person with health and well-being concerns, but as a consumer, as their potential customer. Okay, so this is from Secrets from the Eating Lab, and it's, if you don't win, you play it again. Maybe you'll win the second time. It's successful because the other 84% have to come back and do it again. That's where your business comes from. And this is coming from the financial chairman of Weight Watchers. So when you're looking at all of these different diets that are telling you how to be and what to do and how to lose weight, and that they have the solution for you, remember that you're dollars and cents to them. And ultimately, that's what it is about. But not for us. For us, it's about health and well-being, and that's what's important. So weight stigma in social media, baseball player being compared with Jabba the Hutt. This I thought was particularly disgusting. Someone who I found out later was fired, but this is what he said: "Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation." So that's a pretty stigmatizing statement. And then this is more subtle, and it's what I've been seeing lately on social media. So during the whole COVID-19 experience, we're staying at home and they're suggesting that you wear a mask to stop eating. And that's not so much weight stigma as it is diet culture, but it is shaming to people who read that and feel bad about eating now, because that it particularly is going to impact someone who's in a larger body. So weight stigma in medicine is probably one of the more alarming pieces. And what's so alarming to it is the impact that it has on people in larger bodies actually getting medical attention. So physicians view fat patients as less disciplined, less compliant, and more annoying. They spend less time with them and provide them with less information. And nurses and nursing students are really not that different. They view fat patients as lazy, lacking self-control, and less compliant. Need a sip of water. And so here's the real world problem with it. I had someone that I know that I work with who went for a physical and was completely healthy, right? Good blood pressure, cholesterol, like all the numbers were fine, wasn't going with any complaints, just wanted a physical, and is in a larger body. And as they were leaving the treatment room, the doctor says, "Everything looks great, and I'm sure you'll feel even better once you lose weight." That wasn't a part of the conversation for this person, but it's like this automatic that is coming from a medical professional, not because of anything they're seeing, but just because it's autopilot. And then another patient, that this was not one of mine, but someone that I read about, who went to see a doctor because they were having stomach problems when they were like 18, 19, and the doctor recommended weight loss. And the stomach problems didn't go away, and the weight loss was hard to accomplish. And finally, after going to several different doctors, found a doctor who looked at her as more than just a number on the scale and found the stomach cancer that they were able to treat and lived with this. I mean, if it were a faster moving cancer, this person might not have survived. So what happens in relation to weight stigma in medicine is the plain and simple fact that people in larger bodies don't want to experience the humiliation of going to the doctor, so they wait to go to the doctor until things are more serious. And that's not a good idea for anyone. So weight stigma is positively associated with diabetes, cortisol levels being raised, eating disorders, and disordered eating. And for those who don't know, I call disordered eating the gateway drug to eating disorders. So not everyone who has disordered eating, which is, maybe it's counting calories, maybe it's eliminating food groups, different things that they will structure their life around because of the desire to lose weight. And then everyone with an eating disorder, though, has probably driven through disordered eating. So you might not get an eating disorder, but if you have one, you started there probably. Depression, anxiety, lots of social anxiety, body image dissatisfaction, low self-esteem, and internalized weight stigma, which we're going to dig a little deeper into in a few minutes. So now I'm just going to really quickly, because I don't want to spend a lot of time, but weight stigma does impact what people make and whether they're hired. So this was just a quick study that I found. It was small, but 1 in 5 people looked at a photograph of a fat woman and defined her as lazy. Another one that said that only 45% of employers would be inclined to recruit fat candidates. So it's important to know it's just not as much the topic of our conversation today. So one of the primary places where people experience weight stigma is from family and friends. And as I say that, I want to say that in most families and friendships, it's probably not intended to be anything other than helpful. It's really coming from a place of ignorance, not a place of wanting to attack or hurt someone. But these are some actual statements or things that people have expressed to me, clients and whatnot. So you have such an amazing willpower. I wish I could diet like you. And this was someone who was telling me about how awful it was to sit at a table and watch everyone eat all the things they wanted to eat and not feel like they were allowed to have them. The next one, it won't kill you to let yourself feel hungry. Well, actually ignoring hunger and satiety cues is a real bad thing. You want to listen to your body, not ignore it. You have such a pretty face. If you would just lose weight, and that was someone's mother. People complaining how fat they are when they're in the same size or smaller than you. I like sat at a table with someone who's complaining because of 5 pounds they can't take off. And there you are, maybe someone who's sitting there in a larger body or someone you care about in a larger body. And they're thinking, oh my God, what I would do to only have 5 extra pounds. And it feels really shaming. So, it's one of those think about your audience kind of moments, because even though maybe you might say it's all relative and those 5 pounds to this person is a big deal and I can validate that, and it's not the same as someone who's experiencing stigma in the culture. And then if you're a vegetarian, how can you be that size? Well, because it's not just about what you eat, and that's a pretty silly comment, but people hear it. Weight stigma and dating. So I want to actually, before I go too deeply into this, I wanted to say that I wanted this to be as diverse a conversation as possible. And there is very little, if any, research done on weight stigma and, for example, the transgender community. I found nothing. There's a little bit on the LGBTQ. There's a little bit, but not a lot. So most of what I found is all very heteronormative, and I just want to say that out front. It wasn't a desire to be heteronormative only, but it's what I could find. So women view weight as a barrier to intimacy. And because they think that if we're talking heteronormative, that men won't be interested, they self-select out of dating. A lot of them aren't even willing to jump into the dating pool. But the truth is, while 20% of men would not date a plus-sized woman, 80% either don't care or might even have that as a preference. So heavier women are wrong about the fact that no one is going to want to date them. It's just that this is what we get when this is what we get from the culture. Online dating can put one at risk for food and body shaming, or food body shaming, but that's true kind of at any size. Online dating can be a mixed bag for anyone, but I will say that there are apps that offer plus size dating. Match.com is just the largest out there, so there's lots of plus sized folks on Match.com, but Larger Friends, Woohoo Plus, there's a whole bunch of them. I just grabbed a couple, but they're out there and they're available. And they try and be a lot more careful to make sure that there isn't a lot of people attacking and shaming. So with intimate relationships, there's some good news with regard to people who are in larger bodies and marriage. BMI is what the studies, that's how they're classifying, so that's why I'm using it. But there doesn't appear to be any correlation between whether you'll get married and how big or small your body is. There were studies that showed a correlation between BMI and how many intimate partners someone has. So that a lot of them suggested that the thinner someone is, the more intimate partners that they might have. And then weight stigma experienced by couples. I thought this was interesting. So a couple where both members of the couple are thin, don't experience stigma. When you have one person who is fat and one person who is thin, then what you might find is their expectation that others are going to be thinking that they're not a good fit because of their body. And that might affect the fat person more than the thin person, although they did show that sometimes people who are thin are more hesitant just because of the stigma they're afraid of experiencing for having a fat partner. And then fat couples actually experience the most stigma, where both members of the couple are fat. So one of the pieces that I found, weight stigma, we're going to talk about the gender differences in a few minutes, but there was one study that I read about men who were admitting to hiding body parts during sex because they were ashamed of some part of their body. And 40% of heterosexual men in this study acknowledged hiding a body part, whereas 60% of gay men. And there's a lot more pressure in the gay community, generally speaking, for men to be fit and that like perfect Adonis that is not quite the same in the heterosexual community, although I think it's getting harder. But we are definitely seeing in the eating disorder world more male eating disorders being diagnosed, whereas it used to be considered pretty much just a white teenage girl problem, which is not it at all. So let's talk about the gender differences. So women experience weight stigma at a BMI of 27. So remember that I said like 25 is normal. It actually used to be 27. So they dropped it back a little bit. So 27, if you saw someone with a 27 BMI, you'd probably think that they were pretty normal looking, pretty healthy looking. That's where stigma starts for women. And there's an expectation of social rejection, decreased self-esteem, increased self-conscious emotions, increased stress, body dissatisfaction, and then engaging in those control behaviors, right? So like not eating a particular food group, cutting calories very severely, those kinds of things that naturally happen for women with weight stigma. They really drive the diet industry in many respects. And then I thought this was just interesting. In politics, women in larger bodies have lower ratings in reliability, dependability, honesty, the ability to inspire and perform a strenuous job. This is all based on their body size. Conversely, men have a lot more wiggle room. They don't experience weight stigma typically until a BMI of 35 and above. So they have a lot more wiggle room in terms of how the general public views them. Men report more verbal mistreatment, and that verbal mistreatment is coming primarily from peers and family. I would say women did too, but you think about bullying sometimes, and for men, it's also more verbal. And then in politics, men in larger bodies have higher ratings than thin men, which I thought was also kind of interesting. And interesting in the differences between men and women. So other factors relating to weight stigma, there was a study of people of color and lower socioeconomic status, and they were looking at 3 different factors: lack of respect, blemish of character, and harassment and teasing. What they found is that women experience a greater lack of respect than men, but men experience a greater blemish of character than women. And these are all people of color. And then they were assessing for friendliness, trustworthiness, parenting skills, and who is a better potential mate. And what they found here is that white women rated higher than heavier women in all of those categories. Whereas for women of color, heavier women of color rated higher than thin women of color in all of those categories. And as I say that, what I know being a member of Health at Every Size, which is about the idea that you do not have to pursue weight loss to pursue health. And it's very much a social justice movement. And they will talk about how in many respects, in most respects, weight stigma is worse for women of color than it is for white women, and that it's worse for women than for men. So talking a little bit about internalized weight bias. So it's body dissatisfaction versus internalized weight bias. They're two different things, but they can go together. So body dissatisfaction means that I don't like my thighs. I haven't since I was 9, I'm being totally honest. And so that is not liking a part of the body. But if I turn that into, I hate my thighs and no one's gonna love me and I'm worthless and I'm stupid, that's internalized weight bias. I've now internalized all the stereotypes in the culture and attached them to myself. It creates an increased vulnerability to things I've already talked about: negative mental health consequences, creating a greater drive for thinness, and binge eating disorder. So I haven't really mentioned this, but one of the side effects of restriction is binging. And so oftentimes you'll hear people say, I can't keep XYZ in my house because I'll eat all of it. And the more restrictive we are mentally and emotionally and actually physically keeping it away from us, more likely we are when we're around it to binge on it. So a lot of the things that I believe in are learning how to find peace with those things and not have them be on this like terrified of never touch food list. So binge eating disorder there's a lot of vulnerability increased because of weight stigma. And before I jump there, what I want to say is we have 2 ways to fight weight stigma. One is to fight it by changing how you treat people, by looking for ways to support people in larger bodies, by not using the language of obesity, those kinds of things. And then the other thing is to really check with our own internalized weight bias and fat phobia. I haven't really talked a lot about fat phobia, but fat phobia is what impacts thin people as well, because we're so afraid of being fat that we're willing to engage in diets that create nutrition deficits, that we're willing to separate ourselves from events or family or whatever it is because we don't want to be around things that are bad for us. So fat phobia impacts everyone. Internalized weight bias specifically impacts people in heavier bodies. And so it is a very challenging thing to overcome, but it is something that we can work on a daily basis to shift how we feel about ourselves and start to decrease that internalized weight bias. Unfortunately, the emotion that's underneath that a lot of times is self-disgust, which to me is heartbreaking. And so disgust isn't a rational emotion. It's not something you can rationalize away. So instead, I look for ways that we can start to create a more holistic view of ourselves that is about more than the clothing size you wear or the number on the scale. And so one of the tools that I think is really vital is self-compassion. I went a little early on that, but this is, so I also teach mindful self-compassion, which is Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer's work. And so I like to think about teaching the self-compassion break as a great tool that people can use anytime they notice that they're beating themselves up, or maybe coming from that restaurant where, you know, thinner people are talking about like, you know, oh, I can't eat this, and I'm trying to lose 2 pounds, and all of that stuff that makes someone in a larger body just feel bad about themselves. So when you notice that you're experiencing some sort of discomfort or emotional pain, stop, maybe take a couple breaths and actually name what you're feeling. So you might say something like, this hurts, or God, I feel really uncomfortable or ashamed or sad. And then putting your hand on your heart, if that's comfortable for you, some sort of soothing touch. And remind yourself that you're not alone, that in those moments when we feel pain, that is the moment that we're most connected to our humanity. And from the perspective of living in a larger body, I think I saw that 68% of women were either obese or fitting in the obese or overweight categories of BMI, and it was 72% of men, and that was from 2016, I believe. So, and they keep saying the numbers are going up. So even from the perspective of feeling so alone in a larger body, we're really not. So that's the common humanity, reminding yourself that you're not alone, and then offering yourself kindness in the face of how you're feeling in that moment. Asking yourself, what do I need right now? And see if you can give it to yourself. And this is the kind of practice that can be done in a moment's notice. It doesn't take a lot of time. And so this is another practice I really like. I call it well wishes in the mirror. And if you've heard of loving kindness meditation, it's basically customizing a loving kindness meditation for yourself. So you would ask yourself, what do I need to hear? What do I need to feel or believe about myself? What do I need to experience? And then write those well wishes down. I recommend writing them using a dry erase pen and writing them on the mirror in the bathroom so that it's one of the first things you see when you wake up and one of the last things you see before you go to sleep. Something like, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I feel worthy, may I accept myself as I am in this moment. Whatever those wishes are. And if you don't want to do the bathroom mirror thing, there's always Post-it notes, but there's great ways to do that. Okay, what else? What you see matters. So I like to say, unfollow diet culture accounts, unfollow anything that makes you feel less than. If you keep following it because you think it's going to motivate you, but you can feel that part of yourself that looks at XYZ in your Instagram account or Facebook, and you're like, oh, just unfollow it. It's not helpful. It's not necessary. Motivating with compassion is much more effective than motivating with criticism. Follow size diverse and fat acceptance accounts. I'm going to send out a list of all my recommendations to everyone after this. This will be on there, but there's so many of them now. Podcasts. So Julie Duffy Dillon, Love, Food is one of my favorites. Dietitians Unplugged with Glennis Oyston and Erin Flores, I think is great. Food Psych with Christy Harrison is great. There's a number of others as well. And on the list, I have two specific ones that I wanted to recommend to this group. The first one for Dietitians Unplugged is an episode to help people who are living in larger bodies help their partners to be included in their health at every size journey. It's a really powerful podcast. And then Christy Harrison interviewed Krista Miles, who did a talk on how to find love at every size. And I thought that was a really beneficial talk as well. And instead of repeating it for you, I'm recommending it to you. And then I've got a reading starter list. So I recommend books like Body Respect by Lindo Bacon and Lucy Arafamore. It is like a 200-page book that is, in fact, I have it right here. Whoops. Got that down. So it's a 200-page book or so. What conventional health books get wrong, leave out, and just plain fail to understand about weight. It is a great introduction to this world that I'm talking about, that is a health at every size, non-diet world. Body of Truth by Harriet Brown. The Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison, who also does the Food Psych podcast. Intuitive Eating by Elise Rush and Evelyn Tribole is a really great book about the non-diet approach to healing your relationship with food in your body. And then The Body is Not an Apology is a really great commentary on intimacy and body size that I highly recommend. A few final thoughts. I think I'm moving a little quickly here. That's good. So The first is from the Institute of Health. Weight stigma is likely to drive weight gain and poor health and should be eradicated. And that's the Institute of Health. And then this was an article, The Broken Lens, how anti-fat bias in psychotherapy is harming our clients and what to do about it. And that one is body size is not the problem. Oppression is what makes fat people's lives hard. And I would say there is a cycle to, what James Corden said, that the oppression makes it so hard, and then the destructive behavior can be driven by the oppression. So it's not helpful, it's not motivating, it's oppressive. And weight oppression is so pervasive and unquestioned that if we are not dismantling it, we are colluding with it. For me, that's the biggest statement. If we're not dismantling it, we are colluding with it. And I think that the hardest part is to stand up in front of people who are very much believers in diet culture and tell them you think it's wrong. But the more we do that, the more we're willing to stand up and stand up for the rights of people in larger bodies, the better off we'll all be. So before we hop into Q&A, I wanted to let you know about a group that I'm going to be doing. It is called a Women's Food and Mood Group. So anyone who identifies as a woman is welcome. And it's a small 8-week, and it will keep cycling, support group. So anywhere in the state or anywhere in the United States, it's starting on May 5th. And so if you're interested in it, please email me and I will be happy to talk to you and see if it's the right fit for you. I am also in private practice on the West Side in Brentwood and Los Angeles, Santa Monica. And so I'm available. I have space open in my practice, and I'm obviously working on the web. So anyone in the state of California, I am available and would be happy to help. And so now I kind of want to open it up to Q&A and see what you guys are wanting to know. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Is the medical stigmatization equal, or what's the data difference between male and female doctors? It's a really good question, and I don't have the answer to that. I don't have the answer to that, but I want to find the answer to that and see if I can find it and get back to you on that, since I'm not really sure. Gregory asks, thank you, Gregory. Yes, I can give you the podcast again. So I'm going to send this out on a page with the podcast and the books. But Love, Food is one of my favorites. Dietitians Unplugged and Food Psych. And they're all, Food Psych is not a dietitian. The first two are. They're intuitive eating based and really great topics. I highly recommend all three. So I have a therapy client who is stuck in the traditional ideas about weight and constantly diets. How can I introduce these ideas to her when they will sound so foreign? So really gently and little bits at a time. When I start working with someone who, oftentimes someone will come to me and they don't have food and body issues that they're asking about, but they'll kind of come up. And so when they do, I'm curious about how that diet behavior is making them feel and how effective it is for them. If they're constantly going on diets, it might not be effective. And a lot of times what I'll come up against is someone that says, but I'm not supposed to be this weight and I can't be this weight. And my hope is that I can get them to think about, like what they'd like to experience that they're not experiencing, and how they can start to pursue maybe some healthy behaviors without focusing on weight loss, and just see what happens. But it's really difficult to introduce to people who are, it's very foreign. It's got to be little bits at a time. Amanda asks, if I've been biased toward others based on their weight, how do I actively change the thoughts, opinions that come into my mind? How do I protect myself from harmful media that project these prejudices? I love that question, Amanda. I'm really glad that you asked. I think that it's reading and educating yourself as much as you can. Some of these books that I mentioned that I have on my list. Another one that I didn't put on the list is Body Kindness by Rebecca Stritchfield. It's another really good book. I would start educating myself. And also, again, like I was mentioning, for people who are in larger bodies, the more body diversity that you can see, the better. So having more showing up in your life in terms of like maybe social media by following people in larger bodies. My Body is Not an Apology is a great read. There's a lot of people out there who are doing amazing things, like athletes who run marathons, who are living in a fat body. You know, and then start to ask yourself where those prejudices come from. You know, they're not something that came from you. It's coming from the culture. So, you know, and also having compassion for yourself, because we've all been negatively impacted by this weight stigmatizing, fat phobic culture. So I hope that helps. And I really appreciate that question. What would you recommend for helping people feel more comfortable with their bodies in intimate situations? So I think communication is really good. Communicating with your partner. I think there's a piece of being willing to lean into the experience as opposed to how you look in the experience. It requires, again, that compassion word, because it is uncomfortable. It takes time. And so I would start with finding things about yourself that you feel good about that are not what you're seeing in the mirror. But it is not an easy process. I think that there's a good podcast on that as well, that I'll try and pull and find for you, Catherine. Okay. Samantha, what is a healthy way to dismantle weight stigma when experiencing it or seeing it directed at others? So I try and be really gentle, because most people are not aware of weight stigma and fat phobia. It's just what we live with. So sometimes I'll make little like light teasing comments. I might, if I'm willing, step into the vulnerability of letting someone know how it made me feel when they said that. And if it's something that you're seeing directed towards someone else, then I might bring up that, you know, hey, I saw this talk, and when you say things like that to people, this is the result of it. It just really depends on the situation and who you're seeing express it and how you want to handle it. I see a lot of times I have to do a lot of psychoeducation because I work with teens too, with parents who don't realize that the ribbing that they're doing of their child is actually harmful. So it depends on the situation, but as much as you can gently educate without making the other person wrong, the better. Laura, are there any resources tailored specifically to the LGBTQ community? So I didn't find specific resources for the LGBTQ community. I'm not done looking. I was a little bit surprised that I had as hard a time finding it as I did. So I definitely want to find more, because I think it's important. But I don't, unfortunately, have good answers for that. Do you have strategies for overcoming the feeling that as a woman in a larger body, you'll be rejected out of hand? How to stop opting out of dating, even knowing rationally that it isn't true? I have a hard time believing it. I get it. It is hard to believe. And I think taking little steps where you are willing to step in a little bit, and doing all of those compassion practices and really seeing yourself as more than just the size of your body, so that when you go into dating, you have a little more confidence that you're about so much more than that. I think that the more confidence that we can have when we go into dating, the better. I think that, you know, when you go out, if you're talking about online dating, make sure that your profile, I'm sure everybody's is, but make sure that your profile accurately represents what you look like. Because I think it's even harder when, you know, you've done everything to like turn sideways and make yourself as skinny as you can possibly look. And then you feel all of this discomfort that you're going to show up and they're going to be like, that's not what you look like. So having accurate representations, and then just really, really lots of self-compassion about how hard it is to be in a larger body and dating, and that fear of rejection, because it's real. But I mean, relationship numbers, you know, show that it is just as possible for someone in a larger body to find a relationship and get married if that's your goal, or just be in a relationship if that's your goal, for someone in a smaller body as it is for someone in a larger. Can I talk more about differences I've discovered between mating and dating, meaning the fat sex may be treated differently than fat love? And fetishizing bigger bodies negatively or positively can impact an individual's healthy sexual expression. So I do want to say that in my reading, they said that about 2% of dating for fat people is they're finding people with fetish. So that's a pretty small percentage. And I know that for some people, there's a lot of fear around being fetishized by someone maybe that they meet online. So it is a smaller percentage, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad person or that there's anything wrong with them. They just have a preference and get more excited about someone in a larger body. They may also be creepy, but so may someone who doesn't. So there's that piece of it. And I know I didn't talk as much about sex and larger bodies. I think that I found a lot of conflicting information. I found some information that suggested that people in larger bodies in relationships have more sex than people in smaller bodies. I think that, you know, I know that I saw that for the most part, they were suggesting that people who are in thinner bodies have more sexual partners. I saw that in most of the studies that I found. There is a difference between, you know, fat sex and fat love for sure. And I don't think I have as much information on that as I was looking for, because I didn't find as much on fat sex. They haven't done a lot of research on it. And even the fat love was pretty narrow. So that is an area that we need a lot more information and research for sure. How does Overeaters Anonymous in this space of people's relationship? How do you view Overeaters Anonymous? So first I want to say that I think 12-step is powerful. I think the 12 steps of recovery are just powerful tools for living in so many ways. Overeaters Anonymous deals with this idea of abstinence, and you can make abstinence anything you want, but food is not an addiction. And we can't be addicted to food as a substance. And so abstaining from food is not a good idea. And I know in Overeaters Anonymous, a lot of times there will be people that will abstain from certain food groups, and I come from a belief that all foods need to fit in order to have real recovery. So it's not my high recommendation for people who are dealing with food and body issues. And there are people that I know that are helped by it. I think there's just a lot of talk about not eating, addictive substances in those rooms. And I find that it can be really unhelpful for people who are dealing with eating disorders to have all that talk with them as well. Okay, Heidi. As a therapist in a larger body, I find myself wanting to address it with these clients who feel they are fat but are smaller than I am. I don't want to make them uncomfortable, but I also want to give them the freedom to say all the things they feel, even if they think it will hurt my feelings. So if you're comfortable with that, depending on, what's happening in the room that you're wanting to actually bring it into the space. I mean, they know that you're in a larger body. I am also not in a skinny body. And so I may say something in the room depending on the circumstances. But I'd be really careful because I wouldn't want someone in a smaller body to feel shame for what they're saying in front of me. So I think what you're meaning is if it will in some way deepen the conversation, which I think is great if that's something you're comfortable doing. Hi, Shira. If you're living with an orthorexic, how can you invite them to expand their definition of health without being dismissed? So for those who don't know, orthorexia is an obsession with clean eating. I like to think of Santa Monica as like the birthplace of orthorexia. Shira, there's a book and it's written by a man, and I'm not pulling the name of it right now, but he coined the term orthorexia. And I'm happy to include that. It's really hard to convince someone that their hard and fast beliefs about health are wrong. And I think that, it's about the relationship. It's about expressing the need for them to hear you out. And that book might be helpful. I'm gonna figure out what the name of it is and get you the name of it, because it's literally written by a man who started with just wanting to be healthy and showed how completely obsessive it became and how much malnutrition he experienced because of it. So can you comment about this topic in the context of betrayal trauma? If you're in a larger sized person, if you're a larger sized person and your husband reacted out with younger, thinner people, it makes body image and intimacy difficult, if not impossible. 100%. Betrayal trauma, I think it's, a lot of that is the relational piece, right? Is being able to have the partner learn to have empathy and compassion for the partner that they betrayed, right? So for the sex addict to have that. And that is a very slow and gradual process, because at the end of the day, it's really confounding several things on top of each other. And weight stigma is just one piece of it. But I would also recommend things like the book Body Kindness and some others to start to create a healthier relationship with yourself, so that you can feel better about your body if you weren't feeling good about your body. But yeah, I mean, it is a difficult process of feeling comfortable with your partner, even if it doesn't have that extra weight stigma and youth piece on top of it. I'm sorry, that's a really difficult thing to walk through, but like I do recommend like starting with you and things like body kindness and self-compassion practices. And hopefully your husband is also getting that empathy training that's so important. So I think That's all we have time for. We've gone a couple minutes over. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. This has been a really rewarding experience for me to be able to share with all of you.